Welcome to the suicide prevention presentation for USD 402 staff. My name is Chelsea Jean, and I'm a clinical psychologist from South Central Mental Health Counseling Center, and I work in the El Dorado office, and I'll be conducting this presentation today. So this presentation fulfills the requirements for the Jason Flatt Act, which requires each school district board of education to provide suicide awareness and prevention programming to all school staff, including a minimum of 1 hour of training per calendar year, building a crisis plan, which includes steps for recognizing suicidal ideation, appropriate intervention methods, and a crisis recovery plan. And this also requires the school district to notify parents and legal guardians that the training materials are available. On our agenda for today, we're going to go over some definitions regarding suicide, discuss some myths about suicide, review some statistics both globally, nationally, and within the state, discuss risk and protective factors, triggers, warning signs to suicide, preventative action that you can take. We'll go over a sample action plan and then discuss some resources both nationally and locally. So first, discussing some definitions that I'll be using throughout this presentation. The first is suicidal ideation, and this is thinking about, considering, or planning suicide. Also, for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to consolidate suicidal ideation, planning, and intent into this one definition. So anytime we're talking about the cognitive aspect of suicide, we'll refer to that as ideation. Moving on to discussing what a suicide attempt is, this is a non-fatal, self-directed, potentially injurious behavior with an intent to die as a result of the behavior, which may or may not result in injury. And we'll distinguish that from non-suicidal self-injury, where it is a self-directed, injurious behavior, but there's not an intent to die as a result. And lastly, suicide is going to be defined in this presentation as death caused by self-directed, injurious behavior with an intent to die as a result of that behavior. So this will exclude accidental overdoses, any kind of accidental death by firearms, and different things like that within this presentation. So going over a few myths that we have concerning suicide. One of the myths that's prominent is that suicide only affects certain people, whether it's people with mental illness, people struggling with depression, only affects adolescents, different things like that. A lot of times we segregate members of the population based on this myth. Another myth is that once someone's suicidal, they will always remain suicidal. There's a lot of research discussing interventions with suicidal patients that can actually decrease suicidality in individuals. A third one is that promises of confidentiality must always be kept. A lot of times we see this when working with children and adolescents, that they will ask you to keep a secret for them, that I will share this information with you, but you cannot share that with anyone else. And it's always very, very important to explain to children, adolescents, other adults that there are limits to confidentiality, and keeping them safe is one of those limits. Another one is that most suicides happen suddenly without warning. Later in the presentation, we're going to talk about some specific warning signs, because a lot of times suicides actually have a lot of warning signs, and there are a lot of cues that someone could be struggling with this. And it doesn't happen just out of nowhere. Another myth is that people who die by suicide are selfish and take the easy way out. A lot of times we hear this, that people who struggle with suicidal thoughts or with suicide attempts are selfish because they're only focusing on themselves and not on everyone else who they hurt. And I think more than any other myth, this places us in a place where it's really difficult to show compassion to people who are struggling with suicidal thoughts. Another is, if someone survives an attempt, they will never make another attempt. And a lot of research shows that people who survive an attempted suicide are actually at an increased risk for another suicide attempt. Another myth is that people who threaten suicide are attention seekers. what I always express really strongly is that our job is not to decide whether someone is making a legitimate threat or if they're seeking attention. Our job mainly is to help this person and to keep them safe and not evaluate whether or not this threat is for real or not. Another is that there's no way of stopping someone intent upon suicide. We're going to talk through in the action plan portion of specific steps that an individual can take when they're interacting with someone who is intent upon completing suicide. Another myth that I hear a lot is that talking about suicide will lead to and encourage suicide. A lot of times we have a worry of planting ideas in people's heads that, well, they weren't thinking about suicide until we said something or we started talking about this. And a lot of times what I talk with people about is that talking about suicide doesn't plant those thoughts. A lot of times those thoughts are already there, and we need to be talking about this and opening up a conversation about this. The last myth is that the only effective interventions to prevent suicide come from therapists and other trained professionals. And we'll talk later in the presentation about how you specifically can help in both with people who are intent upon suicide and also in taking preventative action as well. Moving on to some global statistics. This is from the World Health Statistics data in 2017. And what they found was that 800,000 people die by suicide across the globe every year. And that translates to approximately 1 death every 40 seconds. And suicide is the second leading cause of death across the globe for those aged 15 to 24 years old. In the United States, in 2017, the Centers for Disease Control released their findings that suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. And in individuals between the ages of 10 to 34, it's the second leading cause of death. And in individuals between the ages of 35 to 54, it's the fourth leading cause of death. In 2017, there were an estimated 1,400,000 suicide attempts. And I would say there's no complete account of attempts available, so this number is likely higher than that. From 2001 to 2017, the total suicide rate increased by 31%, and that number continues to climb. And firearms accounted for 50.57% of all suicides in 2017. In 2017, 47,174 Americans died by suicide, and that equates to roughly 129 suicides every day, and that's 1 death every 12 minutes. So just to give a comparison, compared to the homicide rate in 2017, more than twice as many Americans died by suicide in 2017. For children aged 10 to 14, 1 in 100,000 children die by suicide. Moving up to ages 15 to 19, 7 in 100,000 youth die by suicide. And for young adults ages 20 to 24, 12.7 out of 100,000 die by suicide. In 2015, the cost of suicide and self-injury added up to $69 billion in healthcare costs, and approximately 250,000 individuals become suicide survivors every year. And then according to the CDC's High School Youth Risk Behavior Survey in 2017, which is a self-report survey, 14,553 high school students seriously considered attempting suicide. 14,541 made a plan on how they would attempt suicide. 10,686 high school students attempted suicide, and 10,620 of these attempts required medical attention related to injuries from the suicide attempt. Moving on specifically to our state, Kansas was 15th in the nation for suicide completion, so that's pretty high. It's the 8th leading cause of death in Kansas, and for ages 15 to 34, it jumps up to the 2nd leading cause of death. In 2017, there were 553 suicide deaths in Kansas. So that means one person dies by suicide approximately every 16 hours in Kansas. Also, for comparison, more than 5 times as many people died by suicide in Kansas than those that died in alcohol-related car accidents. And there's a total of 12,538 years of potential life lost before the age of 65. Suicide costs in Kansas in the year of 2017 were a total of $510,442,000. And according to the Kansas Youth Risk Behavior Survey in 2017, which is also a self-report measure, 2,400 high school students considered attempting suicide. 2,395 made a suicide plan, and 2,062 actually attempted suicide as well. So those numbers are very high. Moving on specifically to some diversity factors, so this would be in terms of gender, race, sexual orientation, different things like that. The suicide rate is actually the highest in middle-aged white men, and they account for 69.67% of all suicide deaths. And in 2017, according to the Centers for Disease Control, men died by suicide 3.54 times more often than women. In contrast to that, adult females reported more suicidal thoughts, and they also attempt suicide 1.4 times as often as males. And the highest age-adjusted suicide rate was among white Caucasians, and the second highest was among American Indians and Alaskan Natives. When we're talking about LGBTQ plus youth, they're 3 times more likely to attempt suicide, and medically serious attempts are 4 times more likely in this population. Their suicide rate is about getting close to 4 times higher than their straight peers. Also, nearly half of transgender youth have seriously thought about suicide, and a quarter of these have made a suicide attempt. 41% of transgendered adults reported that they have attempted suicide, and 61% of transgender adults who are victims of physical assault also attempted suicide. It's also of note that LGBTQ plus youth who come from rejecting families are 8 times more likely to attempt suicide. And for each instance of either verbal or physical abuse or harassment, the individual is 2.5 times more likely to harm themselves. And this is really important later when we talk about prevention and creating safe spaces, not just for LGBTQ plus youth, but for all of our youth within schools, because that's a huge risk factor. Moving on to suicide in young children, just of note, there's a scarcity of data to be found regarding suicidality under the age of 10. But according to Tischler in 2007, suicide is the 4th leading cause of death among children ages 10 to 14, and it's the 12th leading cause of death among children under the age of 12. In the United States in 2009, the suicide rate among this age was 0.9 per 100,000 children. And every year, approximately 12,000 children between the ages of 5 to age 14 are admitted to psychiatric hospital units for suicidal behavior. Children also as young as preschool age can display suicidal behavior and thinking. So just because they might not fully understand or the finality or lethality of the acts that they're engaging in, that doesn't mean that they won't attempt suicide. So although child suicides are relatively infrequent, many children attempt suicide, and these attempts are also a major predictor of future suicide in adolescence and adulthood. And it's crucial to identify those children at risk as early as possible. So next we're going to talk about some risk factors, and some of these will go into more detail later. As I mentioned before, previous suicide attempts are a huge risk factor. Once a child has made a suicide attempt, the risk that they will eventually complete suicide increases significantly. Children who attempt before puberty or before adolescence may be up to 6 times more likely to attempt suicide in adolescence. And these behaviors may begin with low intent and lethality and then increase with age. So it's important to keep an eye on these kids. A second risk factor, which we'll get into in a moment, is the presence of psychiatric problems. This is a variety of diagnoses, depression, anxiety, and we'll discuss those in a couple slides. Also, a family history of psychopathology and suicidal behavior, especially if it's recent and a close family member that's exhibiting suicidal behavior. This is something that can be a risk factor. Another risk factor is a preoccupation with death. If children are talking about death, thinking about death more, dreaming about death more, fearing death more, or worrying more than other children. Sometimes a normal preoccupation that's temporary, that follows a related event like the death of a pet, the death of a friend, a family member, that tends to be more normal and not associated with suicidality. And it's a better sign if the child shows a realistic picture of death and has relatively mild anxiety about death. Also, some environmental and contextual factors, which we'll talk about that in a moment. So first, I want to discuss some psychiatric problems that can be correlated with suicide. The first is depression. A lot of times we see this manifested as sadness, irritability. It can actually manifest as hostility, aggression, especially in adolescence. Showing a loss of interest in activity, changes or weight and appetite, sleeping during class. Another diagnosis that we'll see that's correlated with suicide is what's called disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. This is also a mood disorder, and it manifests more as a persistent irritability and an extreme inability to control behavior. This can result in being defiant or disruptive during class, not turning in assignments, failing classes, being really restless throughout class, distracting other students. Another one that we see is bipolar disorder, and this is segments of an expansive or irritable mood. So having a really irritated mood or a really positive mood for anything from days to weeks on end, and then the other side of falling into a really deep depression, seeing that sadness, increase in sleep, different things like that. That's kind of what we see more with that disorder. Another sign is a student can be isolating themselves, being really quiet, non-compliance. If they're making frequent physical complaints, a lot of times we'll see this in children. They won't necessarily complain of being sad or anxious, but they'll complain about their tummy hurting or complain about just being tired or different things like that. If they're running away or threatening to run away a lot, that can be a sign that they're struggling with some things. Also, a hypersensitivity to failure or to rejection. This could be peer rejection, this could be rejection within their family, a lot of different types of that, which children and adolescents can, if they're hypersensitive to that, that can increase their risk of suicide. And then obviously talking about dying or talking about suicide. Again, it's not our job to figure out if they're looking for attention, it's just our job to intervene and to keep them safe. Some other psychiatric problems include anxiety disorders. This could be excessive, unrealistic worry, fears, panic attacks, obsessive or repetitive OCD patterns, some disruptive or conduct disorders, lying, stealing, bullying, fighting, destroying property, any kind of schizophrenia spectrum or psychotic delusional thinking. This could be confused thinking, hallucinations, delusions, some extreme anxiety or paranoia, maybe displaying like odd, immature behavior or disorganized speech. Another is that they're on antidepressant medication. In some children, this has been found to increase suicidal thoughts as well, and that's something to be aware of. This isn't the case with all antidepressant medication or every child or adolescent that's on antidepressant medication, but it can be a potential side effect. Also an autism spectrum disorder, 14% of kids with autism under the age of 16 have either talked about or attempted suicide versus 0.5% of kids without autism under the age of 16. And it's important to also note when we're talking about these risk factors to get away from that myth that suicide only affects certain people. It's important to note that 11.9% of what we would call normal school children revealed suicidal ideas, threats, or attempts. So this was out of 101 randomly selected, actually pre-adolescent school children. They had never been psychiatric patients, and they revealed a lot of suicidal ideation and then attempts as well. So it's important that kids who have suicidal thoughts or behaviors can sometimes fly under the radar because we would consider them to be more just normal and an everyday kid. And so it's really important for us to be aware of what could be going on with these kids. Talking about environmental and contextual risk factors, one of the biggest ones is access. So if they have access to lethal means, that could be to guns, to knives, different things like that. It's important to know this and check in with parents if their child is displaying suicidal behavior, is seeing, okay, do they actually have access to carry this out? Another environmental risk factor is a negative home environment or stressful events. This can include poverty. They may have a desire to escape an unbearable situation or desire a happier place to live. Poor family cohesion. This is whenever families just aren't connected. They're maybe not showing love and support for this child within the home. Another one that's a stressful event that could be a precursor for suicide is also a divorce. When there's a lot of changes, there's a lot of stress. If the child is kind of shouldering the blame for that divorce, that can be another factor. Another risk factor within the environment is witnessing or experiencing violence. Any kind of trauma can be a huge risk factor. If there's multiple living situation transitions, if children are feeling overwhelmed by stress, this can be a precursor and a risk factor for suicidal ideation and attempts. A history of maltreatment by adults, by other children, any kind of abuse, whether that's physical, emotional, sexual abuse, or neglect, just kind of feeling unwanted, or the parents acting or speaking in a way that is neglectful to that child. Another one is the loss of important others in their life. This could be a loss by death, could be a loss by moving, it could be a loss by mom or dad is out of the picture related to a divorce or some other kind of event that could be really impactful to this child. Some other environmental factors are negative school experiences, negative peer pressure, peer problems, if they're having trouble connecting with peers, if there's fights within the friend group and they're experiencing rejection, that can also be a huge risk factor for suicide. Poor performance in school. A lot of times this is indicative of kids are struggling with a lot of stress, and this can be another stressor. If they're experiencing loneliness within their school environment or experiencing bullying, this could be extortion, coercion to use substances, social media bullying, a lot of different things. This can cause feelings of hopelessness, helplessness, and despair. And then also paying attention to LGBTQ plus children who might be more vulnerable to this kind of bullying or just victimization from their peers. Another one is incidents of suicide within the peer group or sensationalized suicide accounts within the media. It's really important to be listening to what kids are watching, what kind of music they're listening to, and what groups they're connecting with, because there are some that glorify suicide or paint it in a really sensationalized light. So moving on to protective factors, one of the biggest protective factors against suicide is positive relationships within the family, with teachers, with mentors, foster parents, peers, siblings. And this is, I think, where we can enact the most change in taking time for students and taking time for these children, that other people may not be taking that time for them, but fostering those positive relationships can be a huge step in creating safe communities for our children and adolescents to grow up within. Solid family cohesion and support. If a child is supported at home, a lot of times that's a huge protective buffer against suicide. Another one is a strong connection to school. If you have a child who's really involved in school or who's doing well at school, has friends at school, they feel really connected to their teachers. Supportive teachers and counselors are another protective factor as well, just going on that idea of a positive relationship. Another protective factor that's more internal is positive self-esteem. If kids feel like they're doing well at things, they feel like, okay, I can take on these stressors, I can handle this. And a lot of times this correlates, if they're doing really well on an exam, if they did really well in a sports game, that's going to increase their self-esteem. Good problem solving and coping skills. A lot of times this is working with kids to help them develop those problem solving skills, and in situations helping them figure out, okay, how am I going to deal with this, and how am I going to manage this, manage these emotions, manage these stressors, to give them those skills moving forward even into adulthood. Another one is engagement in extracurricular activities. If people feel like they're a part of something and they're a valued member of that group or organization or sports team, that's something that's a protective factor against suicide, because they feel like they have a place and a purpose. And another one is involvement in faith and religious communities. Kind of having this purpose again in life, also being connected to other people with similar values and different things can be a huge protective factor. Specifically, and I covered some of these in the risk factors of suicide, but specific triggers to suicide can include the loss of a loved one. A lot of times children will talk about, okay, I want to be with my grandma, my dad, my brother, whoever they've lost, and this identification. If they identify really strongly with someone that they've lost, that can be a trigger to suicide. Trauma is also another trigger. If children or even adults are exposed to multiple traumas within a short period of time, or even within a longer period of time that they are not able to work through, it gets into what we call a complex trauma. And a lot of times what these do is these traumas build upon each other to the point that the individual feels overwhelmed. And if they continue to experience this, that can be a trigger for suicide. Kind of along the same lines of this, a life crisis. If something, it may be one event that seems really overwhelming, that the person feels like they cannot manage. And if this happens, that can be a trigger for suicide. Another trigger, these two actually are both more physical, either dealing with chronic pain or a disabling terminal illness. So this could be a disability, cancer, different things like that. But a lot of times when things are going on in our physical bodies, it reduces our resources to manage stress. It reduces kind of that emotional stress tolerance and different things like that. And a lot of times whenever you're dealing with individuals who are suffering from chronic pain or illness, they'll talk a lot about feeling helpless, feeling like the situation is hopeless. And that can be really difficult to deal with. Also, difficult transitions, release from hospitalization. Another one can be release from prison. Times where people are called on to reacclimate to life, and they may not feel like they have the skills or the capability to do that. And getting really overwhelmed can also be a trigger for potential suicide. So next we're going to move on to talking about specific warning signs. One thing I would say is to pay attention to things that seem like accidents in children, because they may be suicide attempts that go unrecognized. So younger children tend to use less complex and more easily available strategies to hurt themselves or harm themselves. Even something as simple as banging their head, but with deadly intent. And that's why it's important to pay attention and to talk with kids about these things, to kind of get an idea of what the intent behind that is. Another warning sign is changes in usual behavior. So this may be withdrawing or talking about feeling isolated, sleeping too little if they're getting very little sleep, sleeping a whole lot if they're sleeping way more than normal. That can also be a sign. Acting anxious, agitated, or angry, just kind of on edge, being more irritable than normal. Aggression and self-injurious behavior or risky, reckless behavior. This could be even in teenagers driving their car in a really reckless way, and the intent is to try to hurt themselves. Increased substance use can be a warning sign. Also displaying extreme mood swings, searching for methods online. If you're looking at their tablets, computers, phones, if they're searching for methods online, or if they're connecting with groups glorifying suicide online, that can be a warning sign. Another one can be visiting loved ones to say goodbye and giving away prized possessions. That's a warning sign for something may be going on as well. If they're talking about feeling like a burden to others, feeling like people would be better off without them, talking about feeling that they're trapped in a situation, they're helpless, or they're in unbearable pain, feelings of hopelessness, or having no reason to live. Also, another one can be seeking revenge. And sometimes we'll see this in kids and adolescents where someone that they love or that they're close to has hurt them very deeply. And in a way, they want to get revenge on that person by hurting themselves. And that's kind of how they think about hurting that person who has hurt them. If they're talking about wanting to hurt themselves, talking about death and dying, or more what I would call nihilistic discussions of just wanting to go to sleep and not wake up, or talking specifically about wanting to die or kill themselves. These can be warning signs as well. So the next step is kind of talking about what do we do when we see these warning signs. Well, before we ever see any kind of warning sign that a child may be at risk for suicidality, it's always a good time to take preventative action. And I would say as school staff, you have a unique opportunity because you see these kids day in and day out. You see how they interact with peers or what they're talking about. Sometimes it's what they're writing or what they're drawing, just different things like that. And the best person to check in with this child is likely like people who have a relationship and are close with them. So before a child ever presents a risk of suicidality, getting involved and being available to students, to children, showing interest and showing support in them. You may be the only person that shows any interest in what they're doing. Specifically checking in with the student to see how they're doing. This is really key if they've already evidenced suicidal behavior. A lot of times when we talk kind of through the action plan and different things like that, a lot of times kids or adolescents or even adults will feel kind of awkward after that situation, and they may not bring up that situation to you. So kind of the onus of responsibility is on you to check in with them, see how they're doing. It may be that you just know that the student's gone through a hard time and you're worried about them, just letting them know that you care. Also being willing to listen without judging and showing that you care by being present with their feelings. And sometimes this is particularly hard to do with kids who are acting out a lot, but it can be especially important because that acting out may be a manifestation of something that's going on, and those kids actually may be less likely to have people check in on them and just see how they're doing and showing some care because of their behaviors. So moving on to the action plan, and I do want to throw in a qualifier here that the school has a specific protocol in their crisis plan, and this would be something to talk with your supervisor about and to talk with them about the school district's plan. What I have here is a sample action plan, just kind of some general steps of what you can do if you have concerns of an immediate risk of suicide. But I would definitely encourage you that you need to talk with the school district about that plan. Be very familiar with that plan, even if you feel like you're never going to use it. It never hurts to be prepared. So if you have concerns about an immediate risk of suicide, talk to the student, ask them directly if they're considering suicide. are you going to hurt yourself? Are you planning on killing yourself? That direct. Sometimes that can be very uncomfortable, but asking them directly to assess that threat. Also staying with the child or making sure they're in a private, secure place with another caring person until you can get further help and contacting, whether that's contacting a supervisor or someone else. Also removing any dangerous objects in the room or in the area that you're in with the child. And I will say this, if danger for self-harm or suicide seems imminent, that the child has access to any dangerous objects or is presenting a risk that you don't think you can contain, call 911 immediately. Also getting parents involved as well. That's very important. If you're concerned about a child, it's important to talk to them, but also talking to their parents as well so that they know what's going on. If the crisis occurs during normal business hours, which this would be 8 a.m. to 7 p.m., Monday through Thursday, calling South Central Mental Health Counseling Center. On Fridays, our hours are 8 a.m. to 12 p.m. And so if the crisis occurs during that time, calling us directly, and I have those numbers later on the resources. After hours, the parent or guardian can contact ComCare Crisis or take the child directly to any of these locations. There's ComCare Assessment in Wichita, St. Joe's Assessment, you'd go through the emergency room entrance in Wichita, or Susan B. Allen, which is located in El Dorado. Lastly, when we're talking about resources, there has been an explosion of resources on a national level related to what's been called a suicide epidemic as these numbers continue to climb. And I just included a general overview of these resources. There's tons more out there, but one is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. They have 24/7 crisis support online via telephone. They have a lot of crisis coping plans, suicide prevention toolkits, a lot of different things if you want more information. Another is the Society for the Prevention of Teen Suicide. They have online trainings for educators, a lot of information just dealing specifically with teenagers. Another foundation is the Jason Foundation. This is where the Jason Flat Act came from. They also have online trainings as well and a lot of information related to suicide, warning signs, preventative action, different things like that. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, they have a website and an app that we'll talk about later. The Suicide Prevention Resource Center, they have toolkits, resources, and also online trainings. And then the Suicide Awareness Voices of Education also provides a lot of resources as well. Another national resource is specifically for LGBTQ plus youth and their allies and friends. That is the trevorproject.com. They also have Trevor Space, that's a social networking site specifically for LGBTQ plus youth and their allies. They have Trevor Ally Care and Lifeguard Workshop online trainings, and this is dealing with protecting LGBTQ plus youth and decreasing suicide in these populations. And then they also have the Trevor Lifeline, where text and chat options are also available in addition to calling if a youth who identifies as LGBTQ plus is struggling with suicidality. Another one that I want to hit on is social media, because a lot of times we've seen an increase in social media bullying. People will express a lot of things on social media, and sometimes this can also be either concerning posts regarding self-harm or suicide. And a lot of social media sites have taken steps to help protect their users. So with Facebook, there's the Facebook Protecting Care team. Anytime you see a concerning post, you can just click on the report post, kind of give a brief explanation of why, and typically Facebook will reach out to that person. In some instances, I believe this was in Canada that this happened, the police actually showed up to the individual's door to check on them and make sure they were okay. On Twitter, it's also reporting self-harm or suicidal posts or content. You can report that. On Tumblr, you can email the information to the Tumblr admin using that blog's URL if there's concerning things there. And I will also say on Tumblr and some different sites, There are also suicide promotion groups that really glorify suicide, and this would be something you can also email to them as well, that you believe that this is harmful. Sometimes it goes on the avenue of free speech, but if there's something that you're concerned about, emailing that information to them as well. On YouTube, you can flag the video so that the YouTube admins are aware of that. On Instagram, what you would do is tap the ellipses above the post. You click report, explain why you want to report the post, which would be it's inappropriate, and then select the self-injury as a reason why. And then for Android users, you would click report again after that. For iPhone users, all you have to do is click on that self-injury and it will automatically report. And then on Snapchat, if you press and hold on the snap that you're concerned about until a flag button appears, you would tap this to report the Snap user's story. You can also report someone's entire Snapchat account by pressing and holding on the Snapchatter's name to report the content as well. Continuing on with resources, this is specifically dealing with apps at first. So SAMHSA has a suicide safe app, and this is the free mobile app that helps primary and behavioral health care providers integrate suicide prevention strategies, and they also offer tips on assisting with individuals who are suicidal. So although it's specifically more for primary care, there's a lot of helpful information on that app as well. For students and peers, there's several different apps, and I just put a couple that I found, but there's a plethora of apps out there that have support for students and for their peers struggling with suicidality. So just going over a few, my 3 is targeted towards those individuals who are suicidal, and it aims to keep you connected to supportive individuals in your network. They ask you to choose 3 close contacts that you feel comfortable reaching out to when you feel down. It also helps you build your own safety plan, and it asks you to think through and list your own warning signs, coping strategies, and support network so that you can easily act when you recognize your warning signs. It also includes suicide prevention resources and contact information for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Another one is called A Friend Ask. This is actually an app by the Jason Foundation to teach users how to recognize the signs that someone close to them may be thinking about suicide, and also how to reach out to them proactively. So it provides a list of common warning signs of suicidal ideation, do's and don'ts for this type of situation, and then easy access to resources such as the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Another app is called No Bullying, and this one is, I would say, more for parents and educators. This app is for those individuals to start meaning conversations with your children. You can set reminders to talk to your kids. It shares successful bullying prevention strategies, signs to recognize if the child is being bullied or engaging in bullying or witnessing bullying. And it also helps kind of come up with strategies to prevent bullying in the classroom and support children who are being bullied. Another one is an app called Crisis Care, which has 2 modes, either patient or parents, and it has instructions for assisting teens and creating a safe, supportive home environment. Another app, a big concern is monitoring children and adolescents' usage of their phones and if they are expressing self-harming content on their phones. One of these apps is called Bark. It allows parents to monitor their children's phones for potential safety concerns on text, email, internet, and social media. Just as I said, there are a lot of apps that are similar to the ones that I have listed, and there's many more that are being produced every day to help even with symptoms of mental illness that could be precursors to suicidality. So that's something that definitely become familiar with. Look at those things that can help you, can help friends, and can help the children that you work with. Another resource is the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. They produce More Than Sad, which is a 2-DVD set program to teach high school students and educators about depression and suicide. And another one is the Boys Town National Hotline. You can contact that at yourlifeyourvoice.org. They offer 4 options. And then they also have free resources dealing with preventing suicide. Another one, because we've talked about how trauma and life stress can be a trigger to suicide. Another one is the RAIN National Sexual Assault Hotline. And then one that I think cut off here at the bottom is the National Teen Dating Abuse Helpline. And their number is 1-866-331-9474. And this is if you're dealing with children or dealing with teenagers or even adults who are dealing with sexual assault, interpartner violence. This can be a great resource for them when they're feeling like they're in a hopeless situation. And lastly, locally, we have a few resources when it comes to dealing with children who are suicidal. And one of those is ComCare, and that's in Wichita. And they are the provider for behavioral health in Sedgwick County. And then in Butler County, we have South Central Mental Health Counseling Center, and we have 3 locations, one in Andover, in Augusta, and then in El Dorado. And I've provided the contact information for all of these resources if you're struggling with suicidal ideation or dealing with individuals who are struggling with those. And they can also find a lot of resources at these sites. And that completes our presentation for today. Thank you so much.